I didn't say a word when it happened. That's the part people always find hard to believe. That I just sat there, holding my champagne glass, and smiled. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Fiona, and if you had asked anyone in my family to describe me 5 years ago, they probably would have taken a breath, tilted their head, and said something like, "Oh, Fiona, she's sweet." That pause before sweet, I knew exactly what it meant. It meant nothing else comes to mind. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the second of two daughters. My sister Diane was 3 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand the difference between how we were treated, I understood that there was one. Diane got the new car for her 16th birthday. I got the keys to the 2003 Civic my parents had been nursing along since before I started middle school. Diane got the graduation trip to Europe. I got a card with $40 in it and a pat on the shoulder. I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand the water I grew up swimming in, because when you're in it long enough, you start to think it's just what water feels like. My parents weren't cruel people. I want to be clear about that. They loved me in the way that people love things they've stopped paying close attention to, sort of passively from a distance, without ever meaning to cause harm. My mother, especially, she was proud of Diane the way some people are proud of a trophy they've won. Loudly, publicly, and with a kind of energy that left no room in the conversation for anything else. Diane had a full scholarship to Ohio State. Diane made Dean's List every semester. Diane married a man who worked in finance and drove a car that cost more than my first year's salary. And me, I went to Columbus State for 2 years, transferred, worked my way through school in a way that meant sometimes I ate cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row, and graduated with a degree in graphic design that my mother once described, at Thanksgiving, as something to do with computers. I didn't correct her. I never did. After graduation, I got a job at a small branding studio downtown. Nothing glamorous. We mostly did logos for local restaurants and signage for real estate companies, but I was good at it. I was genuinely good at it, and for the first time in my life, someone other than me seemed to notice that. My supervisor at the time, a woman in her 50s who wore the same three blazers on rotation and drank her coffee black, told me once that I had a sharp eye and a patient hand, and I went home that night and cried, not because I was sad, but because I couldn't remember the last time someone had described a quality of mine with that much specificity. My family, meanwhile, had a different way of describing my career. My father called it the art thing. My mother would mention it in conversation the way you mention that someone has a harmless but slightly embarrassing hobby, with a small smile and a quick subject change. And Diane, who had by then moved to a suburb outside of Cleveland and was hosting elaborate dinner parties with her husband and their couple friends, didn't mention it at all, which was fine. I had learned to carry my accomplishments quietly, the way you carry something breakable through a crowded room, carefully close to your chest, without drawing attention. The problem started 2 years in, when my mother decided it would be a wonderful idea for me to do the branding and website redesign for my brother-in-law's investment firm. I should have said no. I knew I should have said no. Working for family, for Diane's family, was the kind of thing that looks reasonable from the outside and becomes a slow disaster from the inside. But my mother framed it as a chance to finally do something that matters. And I was 28 years old, and still, after all those years, still wanting to mean something to her. So I said yes. I spent 4 months on that project. I want you to understand what 4 months looked like. I redesigned their entire visual identity from scratch, built a website that actually worked on mobile, created a brand guide that their admin staff could use going forward without needing to call me every time they needed a PDF. I charged them less than half my normal rate because they were family. I delivered everything on time. I answered emails at 10 o'clock at night and on Sunday mornings, and then Diane called me, not to say thank you, to tell me that her husband had decided to go a different direction with the firm's branding, meaning they'd hired someone else, someone his college friend recommended, to redo everything I'd just done. They weren't going to pay me for the final phase of the project. They weren't going to pay me the kill fee that was written into our contract either, because my brother-in-law's position, relayed through Diane, was that the contract wasn't really formal since we're family. I remember I was standing in my kitchen when she told me. I had a dish towel in my hand. I set it down very carefully on the counter, and I said, "I understand," and I got off the phone. I did not understand. I was furious. I was also out roughly $6,000 in unpaid work, which at that point in my life was not an insignificant amount of money. Here is what I didn't do. I didn't call my mother. I didn't text Diane back. I didn't post anything online. I hired a lawyer, a friend of a friend who did a free consultation, and she told me that enforcing the contract would cost me more in time and emotional energy than I would ever recover, and that my best option was to document everything, file it away, and move on. So I did. I also quit my job at the branding studio. Not because of Diane, that decision had been building for a year. My supervisor, the one with the three blazers, had left, and her replacement had the management style of someone who'd read one book about leadership and taken extensive notes. I'd been freelancing on the side for 8 months, building up a client list slowly, carefully, the way I did everything. I had 3 regular clients, a logo portfolio that had started getting noticed on design forums, and just enough in savings to give myself 6 months of runway. I incorporated my own studio in March. Fiona Walsh Design, the most boring name imaginable, but it was mine, and that mattered to me in a way I couldn't entirely explain. I got a small co-working space membership near the short north. I worked 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, and on Sundays I let myself sleep in until 8 and go to the farmer's market and pretend to be a normal person. I didn't tell my family. Not because I was hiding it, but because no one asked. My mother called every few weeks, and those calls were about Diane's children, Diane's kitchen renovation, Diane's upcoming vacation to Portugal. She would ask near the end of the call, "How's work?" And I would say, "Good." And she would say, "That's nice, honey," and we would hang up. 14 months after I started my studio, I landed a contract with a regional hotel chain that wanted to rebrand ahead of a major expansion. It was the kind of project I had been building toward without entirely knowing it. Real scope, real budget, real creative control. It also paid more in a single contract than I had made in my entire first year freelancing. I didn't call anyone. I went to the farmer's market, bought myself flowers, and put them in the window of my apartment. And that was enough. The wedding was my cousin's idea. My cousin, my mother's niece, actually, her younger sister's daughter, was getting married in September at a venue outside of Columbus, one of those converted barn situations that costs twice as much as a hotel ballroom, but photographs beautifully. I'd always been close to her. She was one of those people who somehow escaped the family's ranking system, possibly because she'd moved to Portland in her 20s and only came back for holidays, which gave her a useful outsider perspective on all of us. She called me herself to ask if I'd come. She also asked if I could help with some design work for the invitations and signage, and I said yes because I loved her, and also because the invitation design was genuinely beautiful and I wanted to be part of it. I worked on those for 3 weeks and I wouldn't let her pay me. The wedding was on a Saturday in late September, which in Ohio means it could be 70 degrees and golden, or it could be raining sideways. And that year it was golden. The venue was beautiful. Everything was beautiful. I wore a dark green dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like a version of myself I actually recognized. My whole family was there. My parents, Diane and her husband, their 2 kids, who were 8 and 10 and had the energy of golden retrievers at a park, various aunts and uncles and cousins I saw twice a year. The reception was held in the main barn, which had been strung with warm lights and smelled like flowers and cedar. I was standing near the bar, talking to a woman I'd been seated next to at the ceremony. She was a friend of the groom's, a landscape architect from Cincinnati who had strong opinions about native plantings and made me laugh 3 times in 10 minutes. When I saw my mother making her way toward me, she had her social expression on, the one she wore at events like this. Bright eyes, quick smile, the particular posture of someone who is enjoying being seen, enjoying herself. She had my aunt beside her, her sister who lived in Michigan, and who I saw maybe once a year. "There she is," my mother said, and she touched my arm in the way you touch something you're presenting. "My daughter Fiona, she does freelance. Little design projects, websites, that sort of thing." And then she turned to greet someone else. The landscape architect looked at me. I looked at my champagne glass. "Little design projects," the landscape architect said. Not unkindly, just repeating it. Is that accurate? I almost let it go. I had let things like this go my entire life. There's a version of the story where I set my glass down, excused myself, went to find my cousin, and danced at her wedding, and went home Sunday morning and never said a word. But something about the phrase little design projects, said in a room that had my fingerprints on every printed surface, every sign, every table card, every menu, made something shift in me. No, I said, it's not. I said it quietly. I wasn't performing it for anyone. The landscape architect just raised her eyebrows slightly, waiting. I own a branding studio, I said. We just finished a full rebrand for a hotel group with 11 properties across 4 states. And those, I gestured toward the nearest table card, the elegant cream card with the botanical illustration I'd designed. Those are mine. The landscape architect looked at the table card, then back at me. Those are beautiful, she said. Thank you, I said. I'm proud of them. My mother had half turned back, the way you do when you catch a phrase in a conversation near you. I didn't look at her. I kept talking to the landscape architect who wanted to know about the hotel project, and I told her, and the conversation went on. And somewhere in the middle of it, I heard my mother say, quietly, to my aunt, I didn't know she had her own studio. I let that sit there. The dinner itself was where the evening shifted in a direction I hadn't planned for. We were seated at round tables of 8. I was at a table with my parents, Diane and her husband, my aunt and uncle from Michigan, and an older couple I didn't know who turned out to be friends of the bride's family from her years in Portland. The man, I'll call him Walter's equivalent. Actually, his name was something totally different. I'll say his name was Arthur. Arthur worked in commercial real estate and had the conversational habit of asking follow-up questions, which made him immediately my favorite person at the table. Dinner conversation did what dinner conversation does. It moved around, landed on kids, travel, the wedding itself, the barn renovation, whether Ohio winters were getting worse. At some point, Arthur asked what everyone did, the way people do at events where half the table are strangers. Diane's husband went first. Finance, portfolio management, a fund he'd been with for 6 years. He mentioned the name, and Arthur nodded in recognition. Diane said she was focused on the kids right now, which was true. And she said it with the particular dignity of someone who has learned that focused on the kids is a complete sentence. My father said he was retired. My mother said, and I promise you this was not planned. She was not doing this maliciously in that moment. She just did it reflexively, the way you reach for a familiar phrase. And Fiona does some design work. She's creative. Arthur looked at me. What kind of design? And I told him. I told him about the studio. I told him about the hotel project. I mentioned, because it was relevant, that we'd just been approached by a regional healthcare network about a full brand identity system, which was true. The email had come in 4 days before, and I'd been sitting with it carefully, trying not to get ahead of myself. I told him that our work had been featured in 2 design publications that year. I said it all in a normal voice, the voice I use in client meetings. Measured, clear, not performing anything. The table was quiet in a way that tables at weddings don't usually get quiet. Diane was looking at her water glass. Her husband had an expression I can only describe as recalibrating. My aunt said, I had no idea, honey. My mother was looking at me and I couldn't entirely read her expression. It was somewhere between surprised and something more complicated, something that might have been the beginning of a feeling she wasn't ready to name yet. Arthur said, 2 design publications in 1 year is significant. Which ones? I told him. He nodded slowly. My daughter is in marketing, he said. She'd probably have something to say about your work. We talked for another 20 minutes, mostly Arthur and me, while the rest of the table ate their salmon. My mother didn't say anything for the remainder of dinner. Not to me, anyway. After the plates were cleared, she leaned over and touched my hand. You should have told me, she said. It wasn't an apology. It was something adjacent to one, maybe. A preliminary clearing of the throat before a longer conversation that I wasn't sure would ever actually happen. I've been telling you, I said as gently as I could. For a year. You just didn't ask. She didn't say anything to that? I stood up because the music had started and my cousin was looking for people to pull onto the dance floor, and I went. I want to talk about what happened later, because this story doesn't really end at the wedding. 3 weeks after, Diane called me. Not her husband Diane herself, on a Thursday evening when I was making dinner, and I almost didn't pick up. When I did, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I've been thinking about how we handled the firm project." I turned down the heat on the stove. "You were never paid for your work," she said. And that was wrong. I didn't say anything because I'd learned over the years that the moment you fill the silence in a conversation like this, you let the other person off the hook. "I want to pay you," she said. "What you were owed." I had the number. I'd had it written down in a notebook for 2 years, because I'm the kind of person who writes things down. We worked out the details over 2 more calls. The money came as a Zelle transfer on a Tuesday morning while I was in a client meeting, and I didn't look at my phone until after. My mother called me the following Sunday. It was a different kind of call than our usual ones. She asked about work, really asked, with follow-up questions. And when I told her about the healthcare network project, she said, "That sounds like a big deal," which it was. I said so. She said, "I didn't know you'd built something like this." "I know," I said. There was a pause, the kind that has years of small accumulated silences inside it. "I'm proud of you," she said. And she said it simply, without the qualifying pause, without the subject change, without the bright social voice. I was standing at my kitchen window. The farmer's market was happening down the street. I could see people with their canvas bags from 3 floors up. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." I didn't cry on the phone. I waited until after we hung up, and then I did. A little. The kind of crying that isn't entirely sad. It's more like something that's been held in tension for a long time, finally releasing. Just slightly. Just enough to breathe. I'm not going to tell you that everything is fixed, because it isn't. My relationship with my family is a long renovation project that has been underfunded and intermittently attended to for 32 years. The bones are there. The work is ongoing. There are still Sunday calls where my mother mentions Diane's vacation before she asks how I'm doing, and I notice it, and I don't say anything, and I keep that distance inside me that I've learned to think of not as coldness, but as self-preservation. But I am also the person who, at my cousin's wedding reception, in a room hung with warm lights, told a stranger the truth about herself when it would have been easier not to. And I'm the person who built something real and quiet, and mine in a city where no one was watching, without anyone's permission, without anyone's encouragement, without anyone telling me I had it in me. I already knew I had it in me. That turned out to be enough. If you're listening to this and you know what it's like to carry your accomplishments quietly, to smile and nod when someone reduces you to something smaller than you are, I want you to know that the quiet version of success is still success. You don't need a dramatic confrontation. You don't need a room full of witnesses. You don't need anyone to finally see you in order to be worth seeing. You already know what you've built. You were there for every single hour of it. That is something no one can take from you, and no one can give it back either, because it was never theirs to begin with. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually costs to stay quiet for a long time. Not the dramatic, obvious cost, but the slow one. The way it shapes how you move through rooms, how you learn to make yourself smaller before anyone asks you to. For years, I told myself that not correcting my mother was a form of patience, maybe even grace. But if I'm being honest, it was closer to self-protection that had calcified into habit. I didn't correct her because somewhere along the way, I had accepted that her version of me was simply the version that existed in that family, and fighting it would cost more than it was worth. What I've come to understand, and I didn't understand this at the wedding, it came later, slowly, the way most real things do, is that staying quiet isn't neutral. Every time I smiled and said nothing, I was making a choice. And that choice had a consequence. The people around me kept making decisions based on incomplete information. My mother kept introducing me as someone who does little design projects. Diane and her husband kept treating my work as informal, as optional, as something that could be unpaid without real consequence. Not because they were calculating, but because I had never given them a reason to recalibrate. That's the part that took me a long time to sit with. I wanted to believe that my silence was dignified. And maybe some of it was, but some of it was also complicity in a story about myself that wasn't true, told by people who loved me in a distracted, incurious way and never once challenged by me. What changed at that wedding wasn't dramatic. I didn't make a speech. I didn't confront anyone. I just told a stranger the truth, calmly, clearly, without apology, in a room where every printed surface had my fingerprints on it, and something that had been held in place for years shifted. Just slightly, just enough. That's the thing about honesty that no one tells you when you're young. It doesn't always feel brave in the moment. Sometimes it just feels like correcting a small error. But the cumulative effect of small corrections over time is an entirely different story about who you are. Fiona, the one who does little design projects. Or Fiona, the one who built something real while no one was looking. Both of those sentences have the same subject. Only one of them is true. I think about Arthur at that table, a man I'd never met, with no stake in our family's dynamics, who simply asked a follow up question. That's all it took. One person willing to be curious. And the whole architecture of assumptions that had been built around me started to show its cracks. You don't need everyone to see you. You need to stop actively participating in your own invisibility. That's the work. Not the confrontation, not the grand reveal. Just the quiet, consistent refusal to confirm a smaller version of yourself when a truer one is standing right there. I'm still doing that work. Some days I do it better than others. But I know now that the studio I built, the contracts I signed, the Sunday mornings at the farmer's market buying flowers for my own windowsill, none of that required anyone's acknowledgement to be real. It was already real. It had always been real. The only thing that changed was that I finally said so out loud.